Walt Disney was after one thing in the execution of Pinocchio: perfection. And he would stop at nothing to achieve it. Snow White had turned out so well, but by the time they finished Snow White, at the end of that 4-year journey, they felt they'd learned so much that even they were embarrassed by some of the early work on the film.
I watched Pinocchio, and I think this is the one where they went, okay, now everything we couldn't do in Snow White, let's do in this one. Let's make this the most rich visual entertainment we could possibly make.
Very importantly, there was money available now, almost unlimited money, to pursue perfection in a way that hadn't been the case before.
Walt put pressure on you to make it better, whether he had a nickel in his pocket or $1 million. He worked harder than anybody, and he would drum his fingers on the chair, and he'd rub his chin and scowl and think, there's potential here and we're not getting it.
During the late 30s, they had been aiming more and more toward a richer, deeper, darker look in their films, a more luxurious look. My friend Russell Merritt refers to it as the Rembrandt look. I think that look pretty much reaches its apex in Pinocchio. It is the most lavishly, beautifully mounted film they ever produced.
And that richness comes from the work of two men, one of whom was a man called Albert Herter, who was a Swiss artist who'd worked for Disney for some years and had been very influential on the creation of the style of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And the other was an artist called Gustav Tenggren, who was a Swedish artist.
Pinocchio is an Italian story, theoretically taking place in Italy, but it's a very sort of Germanic Italy, and a lot of it was designed by this Swedish artist. So you've got kind of a whole European community going here. And he had a lot to do with that great old world feeling and these wonderful atmospheric, quaint streets of the village that Geppetto lives in, things like that.
Tenggren made wonderful paintings of things like the village and the interior of Geppetto's house. And they were turned into backgrounds by Claude Coates with the most appetizing appeal.
Albert Herter is the man responsible for probably almost all of those little touches, those little knickknacks that you see around Geppetto's workshop. The pipes with faces on, all of the little character touches. The fire dogs in the grate when Jiminy Cricket is warming himself by the coals. All of these rich little details were the work of Albert Herter.
He was a key person in designing the music boxes, the toys, the interior of Geppetto's workshop, giving it this look of a European storybook.
Everybody always remembers the Cuckoo Clocks. There was a great deal of imagination that went into those. The inspiration came from the sketches, but those Cuckoo Clocks actually were built and were functioning props, and the animators could actually watch how they worked. There really were all kinds of technical experiments going on all through the time that Pinocchio was being made, and especially in the camera effects department. There was a man named Herman Schultheis who worked in the camera department then and did posterity an enormous favor by taking pictures of the camera setups that they used for some of these effects and documenting exactly how it was done.
The multiplane camera was a device that the Disney studio invented that gave depth to the animation scene. With this camera, they can do elaborate background paintings and go through the scene. And they did that frequently in this film.
The really standout scene is the beginning of sequence 2, which is the morning in the village, where you've got that famous scene going over the rooftops. You've got not only depth moves, but also lateral moves. And in the end, what they did was do a variation on the multiplane, only instead of shooting down through that big crane, they shot it horizontally. And they had big frames holding these glass panes that were painted for this, only they were gigantic things. And the camera would move forward through those.
The use of models was also very important in this film.
There had been a very little bit of that on Snow White, but that practice really came into its own on Pinocchio. And in fact, the head of the model department was Joe Grant, and he was one of the legendary artists at the Disney studio.
You had to have something in the way of development.
which turned out to be what we call the character model department. We weren't just making models, we were part of the story from the very beginning.
There was also a guy in the character model department named Bob Jones, who had been a professional puppeteer and who actually had come to the Disney studio hoping to convince Walt to make three-dimensional films, in effect, puppet films. Appropriately enough, he wound up working on Pinocchio. And he helped a good deal in forming these models that the animators used. And of course, the great advantage of that was that once the model was approved, then each of the animators who worked with that character could use one.
The coachman's coach that takes the kids to Pleasure Island was also a full-scale model.
There were also models of Stromboli's wagon. And actually, the model for Stromboli's wagon was used for more than just reference. What they did was build this actual physical wagon in miniature, but film it going through the same actions at the same angles that they needed for the film, and then blow up those frames and make wash-off relief cells from them. And then the actual animation of the characters was combined with that.
Pinocchio has an intensification of the sort of painstaking efforts that they'd already put into earlier films. There's a higher level of skill.
It just sparkles and glows, and part of that is because there were so many specialists working on it.
I definitely look at Pinocchio as being the pinnacle of effects animation. It set the standard. It set the bar.
Well, I would say effects at that time were so beautifully done. We still look back at it as one of the most perfect technical pictures we ever made.
When I started working here at Disney, one of the things I did early on was go over to the animation research library. I used to take some of those scenes out. I'd spend hours looking and studying that animation, and it was just absolutely astounding. You have all these wavelets. You've got this surface tension that's moving. Then you add on top of that the actual final drawings where the waves closest to camera have thicker line work to them that gradually gets thinner as you go back on the drawing to help give it even more depth.
I've been going through the work diary of an effects animator named Sandy Strother, one of many who worked on the film. And he worked for over a year mainly on water effects, meaning the splashes and ripples and bubbles and foam and so on, plus the texture of the water itself. They experimented over and over with different ways of getting the depth in the water to look convincing.
They found an infinite number of ways to do scenes more elaborately than ever been done before. One of the effects animators, Ed Parks, said that for the water at the end of the film, what they would do is they'd have the cell, which would have the waves traced on it. They would actually shade the waves with mixtures of blue and black scriptal pencil lead, smoothing this onto the paper to create the sense of modeling of the waves and the play of the light on the waves. And this could take forever to do one of these.
Effects animation really is a supporting character in the film. In every picture, there's always been a sequence where the effects break out and have that sort of momentary starring role. Whether it's the storm sequence in The Little Mermaid or in Pinocchio, it's that whole Monstro the whale sequence, which is just stunning.
All the marvelous water in that whale chase. I think that was one of the finest sequences the studio has ever turned out, because the water is handled without so much logic in the way the waves work to make it entertaining. There's a big wave when you need it. When you don't need it, there's this smoother surface with a lot of wind blowing, a lot of wonderful foam on there. As Frank said once, the water's so believable, a person could drown in it, and then they do.
There was a crazy madman of a guy named Josh Metter who was the effects animator on a lot of that Monstro sequence. If you look at the Monstro sequence, you think, oh yeah, well, so we're going to do this sequence with a whale, and he's going to swallow our stars. But he's going to jump around for a while, and you want to see a water splash? Well, great, we'll show you a water splash, but we'll show it to you from 3/4 of an angle, and we'll have it splash up at the screen, and we'll recreate nature and these wave crashes. The fearlessness of Pinocchio and the artistry is what impresses me, and Josh Metter was as much of a hero of Pinocchio as anyone else.
In the end, I think all of the technical devices and all of the accomplishments of technique that you see in the film are not there just as dry technical exercises. They add up to a film that seems to say that there is no limit to what can be done in a work of art. It seems to indicate boundless possibility.